The wine glasses caught the chandelier light like scattered stars, and Margaret Ellison decided, in that single unkind heartbeat, that her husband did not belong in this room. Nobody said it out loud. Nobody had to. It was in the way. Priya Chandra's eyes flicked down to Daniel's hands, calloused, sun-brown, resting on the white tablecloth, like they'd wandered in from another life, and then back up to her wine glass, as if she'd seen something she wished she hadn't. It was in the way the laughter started. This is the story of a man who never once raised his voice, and the single sentence that made an entire firm go quiet. Part 1. The Invitation. 6 months earlier, Margaret Ellison had made partner at Hargrove and Wills, the third oldest law firm in Chicago, a place with oil portraits in the hallway, and a waiting list longer than most people's careers. She'd worked 11 years for that title. She'd earned every late night, every skipped dinner, every weekend spent buried in depositions while her husband, Daniel, kept the house running and never once complained. Daniel Ellison built things. Custom cabinetry, mostly kitchens, built-in libraries, the kind of woodwork that took months and showed in every joint. He ran a small shop out of a converted garage on the edge of the city. 3 employees, a waiting list of his own that he was quietly proud of. He didn't wear suits. He didn't know what a billable hour was. He knew wood grain the way Margaret knew case law. For 11 years, that had been fine. More than fine. It had been the thing that made their marriage work. 2 people who didn't compete, who came home and talked about entirely different worlds. But the partners' dinner changed something in Margaret. It was held at the Whitmore Club, a private dining room with a view of the river, white tablecloths, a 6-course menu chosen by someone who'd clearly never had to price out plumbing fixtures. The senior partners were there, 2 major clients were there, and Margaret, for the first time in her marriage, found herself doing quiet math about how her husband would look in that room. She didn't tell him not to come. She just didn't tell him how much it mattered. Part 2. The dinner. Daniel wore the one good jacket he owned, navy, a little dated, bought for a cousin's wedding years back. He shook hands the way he always did, firm, direct, looking people in the eye. He pulled out Margaret's chair. He asked the man beside him, a soft-spoken senior partner named Robert Hargrove, thoughtful questions about the firm's history, and actually listened to the answers. It was going fine, Margaret told herself. It was going fine right up until Priya Chandra, a junior partner with a Wharton pin on her lapel and an opinion about everyone, turned the conversation toward him. So, Daniel, Priya said, swirling her wine, Margaret tells us you're in construction? Woodworking, Daniel said easily. Custom cabinetry, mostly. How charming, Priya said. And something in her tone made 2 other associates glance up. Do you enjoy it? Working with your hands like that? I do, Daniel said. There's not much I'd rather be doing. Priya smiled the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile and looked at Margaret. It's so refreshing, honestly, when a spouse is just, uncomplicated, no competing schedules, no office politics. Must be nice to come home to something simple. The table laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Margaret felt her stomach drop, felt heat climb up the back of her neck. And instead of saying anything, instead of doing the one thing 11 years of marriage should have made automatic, she looked down at her plate and let it happen. She would replay that moment for weeks afterward. The exact second she chose silence, Priya wasn't finished. She leaned toward Daniel with the practiced condescension of someone who had never once doubted her place at any table. You know, I actually respect it, she said. Some men would feel emasculated, married to someone at Margaret's level. It takes a certain kind of confidence to just be happy building cabinets. More laughter. Someone at the far end of the table actually applauded lightly, like she'd said something clever instead of cruel. Daniel set down his fork. He didn't flush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Priya with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who had spent his whole life being underestimated and had made his peace with it a long time ago. Can I ask you something? He said. Priya, delighted to have an audience, gestured for him to continue. Part 3. The question. This building, Daniel said, nodding toward the dark wood paneling that lined the private dining room, the hand-carved crown molding running along the ceiling, the built-in bar with its recessed lighting and dovetailed drawers. Do you know who did the interior renovation? Back in 2019, it was. Priya blinked. I know, I wouldn't know that. The Whitmore Club almost closed that year, Daniel said conversationally. Structural issues, water damage in the East Wing. The board brought in 3 different firms for bids. Most of them wanted to gut the place and start over. Faster, cheaper, easier. One firm didn't. One firm spent 4 months matching the original 1,920 seconds. Joinery by hand, sourcing reclaimed walnut to match, grain that hadn't existed in a lumberyard in 80 years. He looked around the room, at the paneling, almost affectionately. That firm was mine. Silence settled over the table like a dropped glass that hadn't quite shattered yet. At that exact moment, a man approached from the direction of the bar, tall, silver-haired, dressed with the understated ease of someone who never had to try. Margaret recognized him instantly and felt her stomach drop for an entirely different reason. It was Charles Whitfield, CEO of Meridian Capital, the firm's single largest client, a man whose account alone represented nearly a third of Hargrove and Wills's annual revenue. Daniel Ellison, Whitfield said, extending a hand with genuine warmth. I thought that was you. I didn't know you had any connection to the firm. Daniel stood, shook his hand. My wife's a partner here. Margaret Ellison. Whitfield's eyebrows lifted with real surprise, and then something like delight. He turned to the table, to Priya, to Robert Hargrove, to Margaret, who sat frozen with her wine glass halfway to her lips. Do you people know who this is? Whitfield said, and it wasn't a rhetorical question. This is the man who restored the Whitmore Club when 3 other contractors told the board to tear it down. I sat on that board. I watched him turn down a faster bid because he said the building deserved to be done right. He clapped a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Half my house was built by his crew. When my daughter got married, the arbor she walked down his work. I've been trying to get this man to take on a project for our new headquarters lobby for 2 years. He's booked out until next spring. Whitfield turned to Priya directly, his tone still friendly but unmistakably pointed. This is the man who built this firm. This room you're sitting in. I'd have thought that was common knowledge around here. Priya's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and reached for her wine glass with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Part 4. The silence. Nobody laughed this time. Robert Hargrove, the senior partner who'd spent the appetizer course talking with Daniel about the firm's founding, was staring at him with an expression somewhere between astonishment and quiet respect. You built this room, he said slowly, almost to himself. I've eaten dinner in this room for 6 years. 4 months of my life, Daniel said, without a trace of triumph. Best project my shop ever did. Margaret sat very still, her wine untouched, watching her husband, the man she'd quietly worried wouldn't measure up to this room, being the only person at the table who actually understood what the room was worth. Whitfield pulled out the empty chair beside Daniel and sat down like he had nowhere else he'd rather be. Tell them about the coffered ceiling, he said. Go on. Tell them what you told the board when they wanted to use veneer. And Daniel, unhurried as ever, did. He talked about matching 100-year-old grain patterns by hand, about the 3 weeks he'd spent just sourcing walnut before he'd cut a single board, about the night his crew stayed until 2 a.m. because the original craftsman who'd built the room in 1924 had used a joinery technique nobody made anymore, and Daniel had refused to cut corners just because it was easier. The table listened, really listened, the way they hadn't listened to anything all evening. Priya said nothing further for the rest of the dinner. Part 5. What she understood. Later that night, in the quiet of the car, Margaret reached over and took Daniel's hand, the same calloused hand Priya had glanced at with such pity just hours before. I should have said something, Margaret said. The second she started, I should have said something. Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching the city lights slide past the window. You didn't need to, he said finally. I've spent my whole life around people who think a suit means something, and a callus doesn't. I stopped needing anyone to defend that a long time ago. That's not the point, Margaret said, and her voice cracked slightly. You're my husband. I let a room laugh at you, and I didn't say a word. Daniel turned to look at her, and there was no anger in his face, only the same steady patience that had carried him through 11 years of skipped anniversaries and late-night depositions, and a marriage built in its own way, exactly like his cabinetry, joint by joint, with care meant to last. I know what I'm worth, Margaret, he said quietly. I've always known, but I won't lie. It would have been nice if you'd known it too. Before tonight reminded you. The words landed harder than anything Priya had said all evening. Epilogue. 3 weeks later, Margaret sat across from Robert Hargrove in his office, and he slid a folder across the desk toward her. Meridian Capital wants your husband's shop for the new headquarters lobby, he said. Whitfield insisted. He also mentioned, and I'm quoting him directly here, that any firm smart enough to have Daniel Ellison's wife on the partner track should probably start treating that connection like the asset it is. Margaret laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. He'd hate hearing himself described as an asset. I'm sure he would. Hargrove leaned back in his chair. For what it's worth, Margaret, that dinner, I've thought about it more than I probably should have. We spend so much time in this profession measuring people by what they bill, what school they went to, what they wear into a room. Your husband walked in, said almost nothing about himself, and turned out to be the most accomplished person at that table by a wide margin. Nobody bothered to ask. Margaret thought about the drive home that night, about the callus on Daniel's hand under hers, about 11 years of a marriage she'd almost let one dinner make her ashamed of. No, she said. Nobody did. That evening, she came home to find Daniel in the garage workshop, sanding the edge of a walnut cabinet door by lamplight, sawdust catching gold in the air like something out of a painting. She stood in the doorway and watched him work for a long moment before he noticed her. Meridian wants you for the new lobby, she said. Whitfield made sure of it. Daniel set down the sandpaper, wiped his hands on his jeans, and smiled. Not smug, not vindicated, just quietly pleased, the way he smiled at any job well done. Good, he said. That building's going to need someone who does it right. Margaret crossed the garage and kissed him, sawdust and all, and understood finally, completely, that she had been the one who needed the reminder all along. He was never the one who had something to prove. End.